This 1920 portrait holds a mystery that no one has ever been able to unravel. Until now. The basement archive of the Greenwood County Historical Society smells of old paper and dust. James Mitchell, a 38-year-old genealogist from Chicago, carefully examines a leather-bound ledger documenting property transfers from 1920 Mississippi. He's been researching land records for a client all morning, finding only routine transactions. At 4:30, with the archive closing soon, James reaches for one last box labeled Miscellaneous Personal Effects, 1918 to 1925. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, he finds a stack of photographs damaged by time and humidity. Then he sees it. The photograph is remarkably preserved, mounted on thick cardboard. The studio stamp reads, Crawford Photography, Greenwood, Mississippi, March 1920. It shows a formal family portrait. A black couple sits in the center, dignified in their finest clothes. The man wears a pressed, dark suit, his expression steady and proud. The woman's hands rest gracefully in her lap, her dark dress immaculate, her eyes meeting the camera with quiet strength. 3 children stand with them. 2 girls about 8 and 10 years old wear white dresses with ribbons in their carefully braided hair. But it's the 3rd child that makes James freeze. Between the 2 girls stands a boy of about 7. His skin is pale, his hair is light brown and wavy. Even in the sepia tones, his eyes are clearly light-colored. The boy is unmistakably white. James leans closer, examining every detail. The boy stands naturally, the man's hand resting protectively on his shoulder. There's no awkwardness, no forced arrangement. He belongs there. James turns the photograph over in faded pencil. Samuel, Clara, Ruth, Dorothy, and Thomas, March 14th, 1920. He photographs it with his phone and copies the names into his notebook. His mind races. In 1920, Mississippi, during Jim Crow segregation, a black family with a white child would have been impossible, dangerous, potentially deadly. James approaches the archivist, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson. "Do you know anything about this family?" he asks, showing her the photograph. Mrs. Patterson studies it, something flickering across her face. Recognition, perhaps memory. "That would be Samuel and Clara Johnson," she says quietly. "Respected family. He was a carpenter. She took in sewing." "And the children?" She hesitates. "I've heard stories, old stories, the kind people don't talk about anymore." She glances at the clock. "If you want to understand that photograph, talk to Evelyn Price. She's 93, lives at Magnolia Gardens. Her mother knew the Johnsons." Mrs. Patterson lets James keep the photograph. Nobody's claimed it in 70 years. Maybe it's time someone figured out what it means. Walking to his car, James looks at the 5 faces again. 4 make sense. 1 is impossible. Whatever happened in 1920, someone went to great lengths to hide it. This photograph is evidence of something extraordinary, something dangerous. Tomorrow he'll visit Evelyn Price. Tonight he'll begin researching. The mystery has taken hold of him, an untold story waiting to be discovered, a truth hidden for 100 years. In his hotel room that evening, James opens his laptop and begins searching. He starts with the 1920 census for Greenwood, Mississippi. He quickly finds Samuel Johnson, age 32, black, carpenter, homeowner. Clara Johnson, age 29, seamstress. 2 daughters, Ruth, age 10, and Dorothy, age 8. 2 daughters. No son, no Thomas. James tries birth records next, searching for any Thomas born in Lafleur County between 1912 and 1914. He finds several. The cross-referencing shows they're all accounted for in their own families. None disappeared into a black family's photograph. He emails his research assistant in Chicago. Need death records for Lafleur County, 1918, 1920. White couples dying within months of each other, especially with young children. Also search orphanage records. Returning to newspaper archives, James scrolls through the Greenwood Commonwealth. Then, on February 3rd, 1920, he finds it. Tragic accident claims local couple. Mr. Robert Hayes, 34, and his wife Margaret, 29, perished in a house fire on February 1st. The couple leaves behind 1 son, age 6, 1 son, age 6, the right age for Thomas. James searches for more about the Hayes family but finds almost nothing. No follow-up articles, no mention of what happened to their child. He searches orphanages, Mississippi, 1920. The results are grim. A 1921 reform report describes the Greenwood County Children's Home. Overcrowded, abusive, children used as unpaid labor. Children as young as 5 required to work 10 hours daily. Suspicious disappearances of children allegedly adopted, but records cannot be verified. His assistant emails back, "Found it. Children's Home investigated in 1921. Multiple children unaccounted for. Director claimed adoptions, but no paperwork. No charges filed. Facility shut down 1923. Records incomplete. Major gaps." James creates a timeline. February 1st, 1920. Hayes couple dies. February 3rd, 1920. Newspaper reports orphaned son, March 14, 1920. Johnson family photo with white boy named Thomas, 6 weeks between the fire and the photograph. James studies the image again. Samuel's protective hand on Thomas's shoulder, Clara's steady gaze. What did they risk? He finds the Johnson property record, 412 Elm Street, purchased 1918. As midnight approaches, James makes a promise to those 5 faces. He'll tell their story. He'll find Thomas's descendants and reveal the truth hidden for a century, whatever it takes. Magnolia Gardens care home sits beneath ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. James arrives at 10 a.m. carrying the photograph and a voice recorder. Evelyn Price waits in the sunroom, a small woman with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. At 93, her memory remains clear. "You're the genealogist," she says. "Sit down. My knees don't work, but my memory is fine." James shows her the photograph. Evelyn takes it with trembling hands, age, not emotion, and studies it for a long moment. "Samuel and Clara Johnson," she says quietly. "I was 5 or 6, but I remember them. My mother knew Clara from church, Mount Zion Baptist." "Do you remember this photograph being taken?" "I remember the talk. People were scared. Having that boy in the picture was dangerous." But Samuel insisted. He said if something happened, there needed to be proof the child existed, proof someone cared. James leans forward. "How did they end up with him?" Evelyn looks out the window. "You must understand, in 1920, Mississippi, a black person could be killed for looking at a white person wrong. Touching a white child? That was asking for a rope in a tree. But they did it anyway. The boy's parents died in that fire, the Hayes family, poor white folks. When they died, nobody wanted him. He had no family." "The orphanage?" "The Greenwood County Children's Home. We all knew what that place was. Children went in broken if they came out at all. They worked them like slaves, beat them, starved them. Some just disappeared." "How did the Johnsons get involved?" "Samuel was working near where the Hayes lived. Day after the fire, he saw the boy sitting on the burned house steps, alone. The county people were coming to take him to the children's home. Samuel went home and told Clara. My mother said Clara cried. They had 2 daughters and knew how dangerous it would be. But Clara said she couldn't let a child go to that place, no matter what color. She said God would judge them if they turned away." Evelyn's voice strengthens. "So they took him. Middle of the night, before the county came, just took him home. How did they hide him? They told people he was Clara's nephew from up north visiting. Mixed-race child, passing for white. Barely believable, but people didn't look close if you gave them a story. Our community knew the truth. The black community protected them. We all kept the secret." "For how long?" "Almost 2 years. They called him Thomas. He played with Ruth and Dorothy, went to church, learned carpentry from Samuel. Sweet boy," my mother said. James looks at the photograph with new understanding. Why risk taking this picture? Samuel wanted proof. If they were caught, arrested, or killed, he wanted evidence the boy existed, that he was loved, part of a family. He saved money for months. The photographer, Albert Crawford, was white but fair-minded. Samuel told him the truth. Crawford could have turned them in. Instead, he took the picture and charged half price. Said it was the bravest thing he'd ever seen. What happened to Thomas? Evelyn's expression saddens. By 1922, too dangerous. He looked obviously white as he grew. The Klan was active that year. Threats, violence. Clara had a cousin in Chicago named Diane Porter, married to a white man, a union organizer. They sent Thomas north in June 1922. Clara cried for days. Did they stay in contact? Secret letters for years. Thomas wrote when he was older, said he remembered them, was grateful. After Samuel died in 1935, the letters stopped. Ruth burned them after Clara passed in 1947, thought it was safer. Evelyn hands back the photograph. It's time the story was told. Samuel and Clara risked everything to save a child who wasn't theirs, didn't look like them, in a time when that could have gotten them killed. Find Thomas's family, tell them what happened. Make sure people know that even in the darkest times, some chose love over fear. James promises he will. Mount Zion Baptist Church still stands on Elm and 3rd, a modest brick building with a white steeple. James arrives Tuesday afternoon and meets Patricia Lewis, the church secretary. I'm researching the Johnson family from the 1920s, James explains. Patricia's eyes widen. Samuel and Clara? Let me get Pastor Williams. Pastor Marcus Williams, a tall man in his 50s, studies the photograph James shows him. His expression grows serious when he notices Thomas. He and Patricia exchange a glance. Follow me, the pastor says quietly. He leads James to the church basement archive, shelves lined with record books and documents. Pastor Williams pulls out a ledger marked 1918-1925. We've kept detailed records since 1912. The Reverend in the 1920s was Walter Thompson, meticulous about documentation. He also kept private pastoral notes about sensitive matters. Williams opens the ledger, turning pages carefully. Here, March 1920. He points to an entry. Samuel and Clara Johnson, with daughters Ruth and Dorothy and Ward Thomas, age 6. Family portrait commissioned. May God protect them in their righteous undertaking. Ward, James says. That's significant. Reverend Thompson knew, Williams confirms. The whole church knew, apparently. Look at this. He turns more pages, showing entries from church meetings, collections taken for the Johnson family, prayers offered for their safety. April 1920. Pray for the Johnson family's protection. September 1920. Collection for Johnson household needs. December 1921. Pray for wisdom regarding the child's future. The entire congregation was in on it, James realizes. They protected that family, Williams says. The black community here understood what Samuel and Clara had done and why. They created a wall of silence. Patricia brings over another box, the Reverend's personal journals. He wrote about it extensively. James reads entries with growing emotion. March 15th, 1920. Samuel Johnson came to me troubled. He has taken in the Hayes child, knowing the danger. I asked him why risk everything. He said, Reverend, I looked in that boy's eyes and saw my own daughters. Could not send him to die slowly in that place. Clara agrees. They ask only for the church's prayers. I give them my blessing and my silence. June 1921. The boy Thomas thrives with the Johnsons. He calls them Mama and Papa. He knows not the color of his skin matters to the world, only that he is loved. This is what Christianity truly means. May 1922. Clara weeps. They must send Thomas north. Too dangerous now. The Klan marches openly. I pray God protects this child and remembers this family's sacrifice. James photographs every page with permission, his hands shaking. This is documentation no one knew existed. Proof of one of the most extraordinary acts of courage and compassion in American history. There's one more thing, Pastor Williams says. He opens a small wooden box and removes a fragile envelope. This was kept with the Reverend's effects, never opened by anyone except him. Inside is a letter, dated July 1922 from Chicago. The handwriting is childish but careful. Dear Reverend Thompson, Mama Diane says I should write to say I arrived safe. I miss Mama Clara and Papa Samuel and Ruth and Dorothy very much. Mama Diane is kind and Uncle James too. They say I can go to school here. I will never forget my family in Greenwood. Please tell them I love them. Thomas. James feels tears on his cheeks. Pastor Williams' eyes are wet too. This stays in our archive, Williams says firmly. But you have my permission to tell this story. The world needs to know what Samuel and Clara Johnson did. Back in Chicago, James dives into city records, searching for Diane Porter. He starts with the 1920 census, looking for black women named Diane married to white men on the South Side. He finds her. Diane Porter, age 26, married to James Porter, age 29, occupation, union organizer. Address, 47732 South Indiana Avenue. The 1930 census shows them still at the same address, now with 2 children of their own, and a third child, listed as nephew, named Thomas Hayes, age 16. There he is. Thomas Hayes, hiding in plain sight in the census records, listed as a nephew. James searches for Thomas Hayes in Chicago through the decades. The trail is faint. He seemed to live quietly, avoiding attention. But James finds a marriage license from 1935. Thomas Hayes married to Anna Schmidt. Occupation? Carpenter. Like Samuel had been, James searches death records. Thomas Hayes died in 1987 in Evanston, Illinois, age 73. Anna died in 1995. They had 3 children, Robert Hayes, born 1937, Margaret Hayes, born 1939, and Elizabeth Hayes, born 1942. James's heart races. 3 children who would now be in their 80s, possibly still alive, possibly with children and grandchildren of their own who know nothing about their family's true history. He searches for Robert Hayes first, the eldest son. Property records show Robert owned a home in Oak Park until 2015 when it was sold. James finds an obituary. Robert Hayes died peacefully at age 78, survived by his wife Susan, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. The obituary lists the children Michael Hayes, Jennifer Hayes, and Thomas Hayes Jr., another Thomas, named after his grandfather. James searches social media and finds Thomas Hayes Jr., a middle-aged man living in Chicago, works as a high school history teacher. His Facebook profile is public, showing photos of his family, posts about social justice, pictures from a recent trip to Mississippi for civil rights historical sites. James stares at the screen. Thomas Hayes Jr. teaches history, posts about racial justice, visited Mississippi civil rights sites, and has no idea his grandfather was raised by a black family who risked everything to save him. James crafts a careful message. Mr. Hayes, my name is James Mitchell. I'm a professional genealogist, and I've discovered information about your grandfather, Thomas Hayes, that I believe you and your family don't know. It's an extraordinary story involving great courage during a very difficult time in American history. Would you be willing to speak with me? I can provide documentation and proof of everything I've found." He sends the message and waits, nervous. This is the moment where everything changes, where a hidden history comes to light after 100 years. 2 days later, Thomas Hayes Jr. responds, "Mr. Mitchell, your message has me very intrigued. My grandfather rarely spoke about his childhood. He said his parents died when he was young, and he was raised by relatives in Chicago. We never knew much beyond that. I'd very much like to hear what you've found. Can we meet?" They arrange to meet at a cafe in downtown Chicago. James arrives early, nervous, carrying a folder with copies of everything: the photograph, Evelyn's testimony transcribed, church records, census documents, newspaper articles about the Hayes fire. Thomas Hayes Jr. arrives exactly on time. A tall man in his late 40s with graying hair, warm eyes, and an open, intelligent face. He's dressed casually, carries a worn leather messenger bag. They shake hands and sit down. "I'll be honest, Mr. Mitchell," Thomas says. "I'm skeptical but curious. My family history has always been a mystery. Grandpa Thomas died when I was 10. He was a quiet man, kind, but never talked about his past. Just said his childhood was difficult and he preferred to look forward, not back." James opens his folder and carefully removes the 1920 photograph. He slides it across the table. "This is your grandfather," he says, pointing to the young white boy. "Age 6 or 7, March 1920, Greenwood, Mississippi." Thomas stares at the photograph, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. These people are a black family, Samuel and Clara Johnson, with their daughters, Ruth and Dorothy. And your grandfather, Thomas Hayes? I don't understand." James tells him everything. He starts with finding the photograph, moves through Evelyn's testimony, shows him the church records, explains about the fire that killed Robert and Margaret Hayes, describes the orphanage and what would have happened to a 6-year-old boy sent there. Thomas listens, his face growing more emotional with each revelation. When James finishes, there's a long silence. "My grandfather was raised by a black family," Thomas finally says, his voice thick. "In Mississippi in 1920? For almost 2 years, Samuel and Clara Johnson risked their lives, and their daughters' lives, to save him from that orphanage. They hid him, protected him, loved him. Then, when it became too dangerous, they sent him to Clara's cousin Diane in Chicago, which is how he ended up here." Thomas stares at the photograph, tears running down his face. "He never told us. Why wouldn't he tell us?" "Maybe shame," James says gently, "or maybe protection. Even decades later, in the 1960s and 70s, when your grandfather was raising his family, racial tensions were intense. Maybe he thought this story would bring trouble, or maybe he was protecting Samuel and Clara's memory, or maybe," James pauses, "maybe it hurt too much to talk about. He lost his birth parents in a fire, then lost his adopted parents when he was 8. That's a lot of loss for a child." Thomas wipes his eyes. "Can I?" He reaches for the photograph with shaking hands. "May I?" James hands it to him. Thomas studies every detail. Samuel's protective hand on young Thomas's shoulder, Clara's steady gaze, the 2 girls flanking him. "They saved him," Thomas whispers. "They saved my grandfather, which means they saved all of us. My father, me, my children. None of us would exist if not for their courage." "That's right." Thomas looks up. "Are there descendants from the Johnson family?" "I believe so. I haven't traced them yet. I wanted to find you first. But Ruth and Dorothy both had children. There's a family tree out there that connects to yours through the years 1920 to 1922, through love instead of blood." Thomas sets the photograph down carefully. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to tell my family. My siblings, my cousins. We need to know this story. And then," he takes a deep breath, "I want to find the Johnson descendants. I want to thank them somehow for what their ancestors did." "I was hoping you'd say that." They talk for 2 more hours. James shows Thomas every document, every piece of evidence. Thomas asks questions, takes photos, makes notes. He's a historian by training and profession. He wants to understand everything, verify everything, make sense of this revelation that's rewritten his family's story. As they prepare to leave, Thomas grips James's hand firmly. "Thank you. Thank you for finding this, for caring enough to track it down, for bringing this to me. It's the most important thing I've ever learned about my family." "There's one more thing," James says. He pulls out the letter young Thomas wrote to Reverend Thompson in 1922. "Your grandfather wrote this 2 months after arriving in Chicago. He was 7 years old." Thomas reads it, and when he finishes, he's crying again. He loved them. He called them Mama and Papa. He never forgot them. And we forgot him. We let this story disappear. Thomas folds the letter carefully. "That changes now. Will you help me find the Johnson family? Absolutely. James returns to his research with renewed purpose. He needs to find the descendants of Ruth and Dorothy Johnson, the two girls in the photograph who grew up knowing they had briefly shared their home with a white boy their parents saved. He starts with Ruth, the older daughter. In the 1930 census, Ruth Johnson, aged 20, still lives with her parents in Greenwood. But by 1940, she's gone, likely married. James searches marriage records for Leflore County, Mississippi, 1930-1940. He finds it. Ruth Johnson married to William Crawford in 1933. Crawford, the same name as the photographer who took the 1920 portrait. James digs deeper and finds the connection. William Crawford was Albert Crawford's son. The photographer who documented the Johnson family's courage had a son who fell in love with Ruth Johnson and married her. They had 4 children: Albert Jr., Clara, named after Ruth's mother, Samuel, named after Ruth's father, and Mary. James traces them forward. Clara Crawford, born 1937, married Jerome Washington in 1958 and moved to Memphis. They had 3 children, including a daughter named Ruth Washington, born 1962. James finds Ruth Washington on social media. She's 63, a retired teacher living in Memphis, posts frequently about family, church, and civil rights history. He sends her a message similar to the one he sent Thomas Hayes Jr., explaining that he's discovered an extraordinary story about her great-grandparents. Ruth Washington responds within hours. My grandmother. Ruth told me stories when I was young about something secret my great-grandparents did, something brave. She said I'd understand when I was older, but she died before she could tell me. Is this about that? James arranges to call her. When they speak, he tells her everything, shows her the photographs and documents via video call. Ruth Washington listens with her hand over her mouth, tears streaming. They saved a white child, she whispers. In Mississippi, in 1920. Oh, my Lord. Your grandmother, Ruth, knew him. She was 10 years old when he came to live with them. She would have remembered everything. She never told us the details. Just said her parents did something dangerous and good, something that showed what real Christianity meant. We always wondered. James then tells her about Thomas Hayes Jr., about finding the grandson of the boy her great-grandparents saved. He wants to meet you, James says. He wants to thank your family for what Samuel and Clara did. Ruth Washington is silent for a moment, overwhelmed. 100 years later, she finally says. The family's coming back together after 100 years. If you're willing? Of course I'm willing. This is everything my grandmother hoped for, I think. She wanted this story told. She wanted people to know what her parents did. James then searches for Dorothy's descendants. Dorothy Johnson married Marcus Lewis in 1935, moved to Chicago during the Great Migration in 1942. They had 5 children. One of them, Patricia Lewis, born 1945, still lives in Chicago. James realizes with a start, Patricia Lewis, Pastor Marcus Williams, the church secretary and pastor at Mount Zion Baptist Church, who helped him find the church records. They're descendants of the Johnson family. They already knew parts of the story. They'd been protecting it, preserving it, waiting for the right moment. James calls Pastor Williams. You knew, he says. You're Dorothy Johnson's grandson. I am, Williams confirms. My grandmother Dorothy told my mother everything before she died. And my mother told me. We've been waiting for someone to put all the pieces together, someone from outside who could tell this story properly. Why didn't you tell me immediately? Because the story needed to be discovered, not handed over. You found the photograph, you tracked down Evelyn, you connected the dots. That gives it authenticity, makes it real. If we just told you, it might have seemed like family legend, exaggeration. This way, you verified everything independently. James understands. Thomas Hayes Jr. wants to meet the family. Ruth Washington in Memphis, too. Then we'll make that happen, Pastor Williams says. We'll bring everyone together. The descendants of Samuel and Clara Johnson and the descendants of the boy they saved. This is what my great-grandparents would have wanted. 3 months later, on a warm Saturday in June, 2 families gather at Mount Zion Baptist Church in Greenwood, Mississippi. Ruth Washington has come from Memphis with her 3 children and 2 grandchildren. Pastor Marcus Williams is there with his extended family, 7 descendants of Dorothy Johnson. Other Johnson family members have traveled from across the country, nearly 30 people in total. And Thomas Hayes Jr. has brought his entire family, his 2 sisters, his children, his cousins, his nieces and nephews. 23 people who carry the blood of the boys Samuel and Clara Johnson, saved in 1920. The church sanctuary is full. Media is not invited. This is private, sacred. James Mitchell stands at the front with Pastor Williams. Between them, displayed on a large screen, is the 1920 photograph: Samuel, Clara, Ruth, Dorothy, and young Thomas. Thomas Hayes Jr. speaks first. His voice shakes with emotion. I'm standing here today because of an act of extraordinary courage and love. My grandfather, Thomas Hayes, lost his parents in a fire when he was 6 years old. He should have been sent to an orphanage where he likely would have died or been broken. Instead, two people, Samuel and Clara Johnson, risked everything to save him. He looks at the Johnson descendants gathered before him. They weren't rich. They weren't powerful. They were a black family in Jim Crow, Mississippi, which meant they lived every day under threat of violence. Taking in a white child could have gotten them killed, and they did it anyway. Thomas pauses, composing himself. My grandfather lived to be 73 years old. He married my grandmother, raised my father and aunt and uncle, saw grandchildren born. He worked as a carpenter, a trade he learned from Samuel Johnson. He lived a good, quiet, decent life. And all of that, all of us, exist because of what your ancestors did. He steps down and approaches Ruth Washington. I don't have words adequate to thank you, but I want you to know. We will never forget this. We will tell this story to our children and grandchildren. We will make sure Samuel and Clara Johnson's courage is remembered. Ruth Washington embraces him, both of them crying. Around the sanctuary, there's not a dry eye. Pastor Williams speaks next. My great-grandparents, Samuel and Clara Johnson, were ordinary people who did an extraordinary thing. They saw a child in danger and responded with love, despite the risk. That's the simplest and most profound truth of this story. He gestures to the photograph on the screen. This picture was taken as evidence, as proof that Thomas existed and was loved. Samuel knew it was dangerous to document what they'd done, but he insisted. He wanted there to be a record, even if it cost them. And now, 100 years later, that photograph has brought our families together. Ruth Washington then shares stories her grandmother Ruth told her, memories of young Thomas playing with her and Dorothy, learning carpentry from Samuel, helping Clara in the garden. My grandmother said Thomas was shy at first, traumatized by losing his parents. But slowly, over months, he began to smile again, to laugh. She said Clara would hold him and sing to him, and Samuel taught him to measure wood and use tools. They loved him like their own. She pauses. And when they had to send him away, when it became too dangerous, my grandmother said her mother cried for weeks. Clara never stopped thinking about him, wondering if he was safe, if he was happy. She kept hoping for letters, for news, and she got some, secretly, for years, until the letters stopped. Thomas Hayes, Jr. stands again. I have something to share. He pulls out a box he's brought with him. When my grandfather died, we found this in his attic. We never knew what it meant, but now we do. He opens the box. Inside is a small wooden toy, a carved horse worn smooth by time and handling. Samuel Johnson made this for my grandfather. We know because there's a tiny SJ carved under the base. My grandfather kept it his entire life. 73 years, he kept this toy, kept this connection to the family who saved him. He hands the toy to Pastor Williams. This belongs in your family's history. It's proof that he never forgot them, just as they never forgot him. The two families mingle, share stories, embrace. Strangers by blood, but connected by a bond stronger than genetics. The bond of sacrifice and love across the color line in one of America's darkest times. James watches it all, documenting with photos and notes, witnessing history correcting itself. After the gathering, Thomas Hayes Jr. and Pastor Marcus Williams hold a press conference outside the church. The story has leaked. Too many people knew about the reunion, and now journalists from across the country have descended on Greenwood. Thomas speaks to the cameras. In 1920, my grandfather Thomas Hayes lost his parents in a fire. He was 6 years old, alone, and about to be sent to an abusive orphanage. A black family named Johnson took him in, hid him, protected him, and loved him, at tremendous risk to themselves. Today, our families reunited to honor that act of courage. He holds up the 1920 photograph. This picture was taken as evidence, as proof that a child existed and mattered. Samuel and Clara Johnson wanted the world to know that they had loved this boy, even if it cost them everything. 100 years later, their wish has come true. The world now knows. The story goes viral. Major newspapers run it. Television networks feature it. Social media explodes with shares and comments. The photograph of Samuel, Clara, and the children is seen by millions. The response is overwhelming. People are moved, inspired, challenged. In the comments and conversations that follow, people discuss racism, courage, compassion, and what it means to do right despite the cost. Some criticize. Why focus on a black family saving a white child? What about all the black children who needed saving? It's a fair question, and Pastor Williams addresses it directly in interviews. This story doesn't diminish other struggles, he says firmly. Samuel and Clara Johnson's daughters, my grandmother and great-aunt, faced racism their entire lives. The Johnson family knew oppression intimately. That's what makes their choice so powerful. Despite everything they suffered, despite the danger, they chose love. They chose to save a child who would grow up with privileges they'd never have. That's not a statement that racism doesn't matter. It's proof that their humanity transcended it. Thomas Hayes Jr. adds, I grew up white in America, with all the advantages that brings. My grandfather grew up white. Our family has benefited from systemic racism for generations. But none of us would exist if not for a black family's courage. That's a debt we can never repay, but we can honor it by fighting against the systems that made their act so dangerous in the first place. The Hayes and Johnson families establish a foundation in Samuel and Clara Johnson's names, funding scholarships for foster children and supporting child welfare reform. The 1920 photograph is donated to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., where it's displayed with the full story, a testament to courage, love, and the best of human nature. James Mitchell writes a book about the discovery and the families, documenting every detail. The proceeds are split between the Johnson and Hayes descendants. Mount Zion Baptist Church becomes a pilgrimage site. People come from across the country to see where Samuel and Clara worshipped, to walk the streets they walked, to pay respects to their courage. The house at 412 Elm Street, long abandoned, is purchased by the foundation and restored as a museum and educational center, teaching visitors about Jim Crow-era racism and the individuals who resisted it through quiet acts of profound courage. Years later, James reflects on what the story means. As Samuel and Clara Johnson weren't famous, he tells an interviewer. They didn't lead movements or give speeches. They were working people trying to survive in a brutal racist system. But when confronted with a choice, ignore a child's suffering or risk everything to help, they chose love. That's heroism. Not the loud kind, but the kind that changes the world one life at a time. Thomas Hayes Jr., now in his 60s, speaks at schools and churches, telling his grandfather's story and the Johnson sacrifice. My grandfather lived because two people cared more about a child's life than their own safety, he says. That's the America I want to build, where we see each other's humanity first, where we take risks for each other, where love overcomes fear. The Johnson descendants carry their ancestors' legacy with pride. Ruth Washington's granddaughter studying social work says, "I'm not surprised Samuel and Clara did what they did. When I look at their photograph, I see it in their eyes. Strength, compassion, determination. They raised their daughters to have those same qualities. It's in our family, passed down. 5 years after the reunion, the families gather again, this time for a happier occasion. Thomas Hayes Jr.'s daughter, Sarah, is marrying Marcus Williams III, Pastor Williams' grandson. The wedding takes place at Mount Zion Baptist Church, where Samuel and Clara worshipped, where Reverend Thompson documented their courage, where two families reunited after a century. The church is decorated with photographs spanning generations. Samuel and Clara with young Thomas in 1920. Thomas Hayes as an adult with his wife and children. The Johnson descendants through the decades. And now this moment, two families joined not just by history but by love. During the ceremony, Sarah and Marcus honor their ancestors. They place flowers before a portrait of Samuel and Clara Johnson, acknowledging that without them, neither family would be here today. Love brought us together twice, Marcus says in his vows. First in 1920, when my great-great-grandparents saved Sarah's great-grandfather, and now in 2025, when we choose each other, we carry their legacy forward, the legacy of love that transcends every barrier. Oh, but the reception is joyful, celebratory. Hayes and Johnson descendants dance together, sharing stories, strengthening bonds formed 5 years earlier. The divisions of race that once made their connection impossible now seem distant, overcome by shared history and chosen family. James Mitchell attends as an honored guest. Now in his mid-40s, he's built his career on this story, but his greatest satisfaction comes from watching these families thrive together. This is what I hoped for, he tells Ruth Washington, now 71. Not just uncovering the past, but healing it, bringing it forward. You gave us back our history, Ruth says. We always knew Samuel and Clara were special, but we didn't know the full story. Now we do. Now the world does. As the evening ends, the families gather for a photograph. Dozens of descendants of both families standing together where Samuel and Clara once stood, in front of the church that sheltered their secret. Someone produces the original 1920 photograph and holds it up. Then, now, a century between them, but the connection unbroken, Thomas Hayes Jr. looks at the old photograph one more time, at his grandfather's young face, at Samuel's protective hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," he whispers to those long-gone faces. "Thank you for everything." Later that night, Sarah and Marcus visit Samuel and Clara's graves in the church cemetery. The headstones, once neglected, have been restored, cleaned, and surrounded by flowers that descendants plant regularly. "We're naming our first child after them," Sarah says quietly. "Samuel, if it's a boy, Clara, if it's a girl, so the names continue, so they're never forgotten." Marcus takes her hand. "They won't be forgotten. Their story is part of history now, part of the record." They stand in silence for a moment, honoring the courage that made everything possible. Above them, stars shine over Mississippi. The same stars that shone on Samuel and Clara Johnson in 1920, when they made their impossible choice. The same stars that shine on their descendants now, living the future those two brave souls made possible. A photograph taken in 1920 held a mystery no one could explain. Now, a century later, the mystery has been solved and revealed a story of courage, sacrifice, and love that transcended the cruelest barriers ever erected between human beings. Samuel and Clara Johnson risked everything to save a child who wasn't theirs. They asked nothing in return. They expected no recognition, no reward, no glory. They did it because it was right, because a child needed help, because love demanded it. And now their story will be told forever. A reminder that even in the darkest times, even in the most unjust systems, individual acts of courage and compassion can change the world. The photograph remains in the Smithsonian, viewed by thousands each year. But its true legacy lives in the families, Hayes and Johnson, white and black, forever bound by an act of love that refused to recognize the color line. This is the mystery solved, that humanity, at its best, is stronger than hatred. This is the truth revealed, that love at its core sees no color, only a child who needs saving and the courage to act. Samuel and Clara Johnson are gone. But their legacy lives on in their descendants, in the family they saved, and in everyone who hears their story and chooses to be brave, to be kind, to be human.